Imagine a world where 1/3 of the entire population vanishes in just a few years. It sounds like science fiction, but this was the terrifying reality of the 14th century. This is the story of the Black Death, a pandemic that reshaped civilization. To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we have to travel back in time. Not to Europe, but far to the east, to the vast, arid steppes of Central Asia. In the early 1300s, this region was a crossroads of empires and a hotbed of trade. It was also home to a creature you might not expect, the marmot. These large ground squirrels carried fleas, and those fleas carried a deadly secret, a bacterium called yes. For centuries, this bacterium had existed in a relatively stable cycle among rodent populations. But something changed. Climate shifts, perhaps a period of cooling and drought, forced these rodents out of their natural habitats and into closer contact with humans and their livestock. The fleas, needing a new host, jumped. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, had created the Silk Road, a network of trade routes that connected Asia to Europe like never before. It was a marvel of its time, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. But this incredible connectivity came with a hidden price. As caravans laden with silk, spices, and precious metals moved west, they unknowingly carried rats, a common sight in trade, caravans, and bustling port cities, boarded the ships and wagons, and on these rats were the infected fleas. Our journey with the plague really begins to accelerate around 1346, near the Black Sea. The city of Kaffa, a bustling trading post controlled by Italian merchants from Genoa, found itself under siege by the Mongol Golden Horde. The siege was long and grueling. Then, the attackers began to fall ill with a mysterious and horrifying sickness. They developed painful swellings, fevers, and then, swiftly, died. In an act of what might be the first recorded instance of biological warfare, the Mongol commander ordered the catapults to launch not stones, but the infected corpses of his own soldiers over the city walls. The scene inside Kaffa must have been apocalyptic. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. The Genoese merchants, desperate to escape, abandoned the city and fled by sea, heading back towards the safety of their homes in Italy. They had no idea they were bringing the apocalypse with them. Their ships were floating incubators for the plague. The rats scurried in the cargo holds, the fleas multiplied, and the bacteria thrived. In October of 3047, 12 of these Genoese galleys sailed into the Sicilian port of Messina. The people of Messina who gathered at the docks were met with a ghastly sight. Most of the sailors aboard were either dead or gravely ill, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. These boils, called buboes, gave the disease its name, the bubonic plague. The Sicilian authorities, horrified, quickly ordered the fleet of death ships out of the harbor. But it was too late. The plague had already disembarked from Messina. The Black Death exploded across Europe with terrifying speed. It was a perfect storm. Europe was already weakened by famine and a century of warfare. Its cities were growing, but they were crowded, unsanitary, and filled with rats. The disease spread along the very trade routes that fueled Europe's economy. From Sicily, it moved up the Italian peninsula, hitting major hubs like Genoa, Venice, and Florence. By January 1348, it had reached Marseille in France. From there, it branched out, moving up the Rhine River, overland into Spain, and across the Channel to England. There were actually 3 forms of the plague. The most common was the bubonic plague, spread by flea bites. It was brutal with a mortality rate of 30 to 75%. Then there was the pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs and could be spread from person to person simply by coughing or breathing. This form was almost 100% fatal. The third, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. It was so swift that victims could literally go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. Imagine the terror. No one understood what was causing it. Was it a punishment from God? A poison in the air? A miasma? Was it caused by the alignment of the planets? People tried everything to protect themselves. They fled the cities. They carried flowers and herbs to ward off the bad air. They prayed. They whipped themselves in public processions as penance. But nothing worked. Doctors in their beaked masks, filled with aromatic herbs, were powerless. The plague didn't discriminate. It took the rich and the poor, the young and the old, the clergy and the commoner. In the city of Florence, which lost over half its population, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio described the complete breakdown of society. He wrote, "Brother was forsaken by brother-nephew, by uncle-sister, by brother and oftentimes husband by wife. What is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children to their fate, untended, unvisited. It was a world turned upside down. Fields were left unplowed, animals roamed free, and the dead were often buried in mass graves, if they were buried at all." By 1351, when the first wave of the plague finally began to recede, Europe was a changed continent. It's estimated that somewhere between 75 and 200 million people had died. In some regions, the death toll was as high as 60%. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a fundamental reset of European civilization. The world had been brought to its knees by an invisible enemy that had traveled thousands of miles from a humble marmot on the Asian steppe to the heart of medieval Europe, leaving a trail of devastation that would echo for centuries. The arrival was just the beginning. The world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death would be a very different one indeed. Imagine a world where 1/3 of the population vanishes in just a few years. A world where vibrant cities become silent graveyards, and the line between the living and the dead blurs into a horrifying haze. This isn't the plot of a disaster movie. This was the reality of the 14th century, a period haunted by a shadow known as the Black Death. Today, we journey back in time to uncover the story of the Great Dying, to walk the streets of the cities of the dead, and to understand how this catastrophic plague reshaped the course of human history. Our story begins not in Europe, but on the arid plains of Central Asia in the 1330s. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, had long existed in populations of rodents like mice, but a combination of climate change and shifting trade routes brought infected fleas, carried by black rats, into closer contact with humans. These rats became stowaways on the burgeoning Silk Road, the great artery of trade connecting east and west. By 1346, the plague had reached the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a bustling hub controlled by Genoese traders. During a siege, the attacking Mongol army, ravaged by the disease, reportedly catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, one of history's earliest and most terrifying examples of biological warfare. Fleeing the besieged city, Genoese ships carried not just goods and people, but an invisible and deadly passenger. The rats and their fleas disembarked at every port they touched. In October 1347, 12 of TC Death ships docked at Messina, Sicily. The sailors who weren't already dead were gravely ill, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, horrified, ordered the fleet to leave, but it was too late. The plague was ashore. From Italy, it spread with terrifying speed. It followed the trade routes, moving inland along rivers and roads. By January 1348, it had hit Marseille in France and Tunis in North Africa. Be that summer, Paris, Florence, London, and countless other towns and villages were in its grip. No one was safe. It crossed mountains and oceans, reaching Germany, Spain, and England by 1348, and Scandinavia and Russia by 1350. The world, for all its vastness, suddenly felt terrifyingly small and interconnected. So what was it like to face this unseen enemy? The Black Death manifested in 3 primary forms. The most common was the bubonic plague. Within days of being bitten by an infected flea, victims would develop a high fever, chills, and extreme weakness. Then came the telltale sign. These were agonizingly painful swellings of the lymph nodes, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck. They could grow to the size of an apple and would turn black as the tissue died, giving the plague its grim name. Without treatment, which of course didn't exist, the bubonic plague was fatal in up to 80% of cases. Even more deadly was the pneumonic plague. This form attacked the lungs and was spread through the air by victims would cough up blood, and death was almost certain, often within a day or two. The rarest but most lethal was the septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. It caused high fevers and purple or black skin patches as blood clotted under the skin. Septicemic plague was 100% fatal, killing its victims so quickly that sometimes the buboes didn't even have time to form. People could literally go to bed healthy and be dead by morning. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. Imagine the sheer terror. Your neighbor, who you spoke to yesterday, is gone today. Your family members fall ill one by one, and you are powerless to help. People had no understanding of germs or bacteria. They blamed miasmas, or bad air, the alignment of planets, or, most tragically, divine punishment for humanity's sins. This led to a wave of religious fervor. Processions of flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance, hoping to appease an angry god. Ironically, their travels and crowded gatherings only helped to spread the disease further. In their desperation and fear, many people sought scapegoats. Jewish communities across Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells and were subjected to horrific persecutions and massacres, a dark stain on an already dark time. As the death toll mounted, the very fabric of society began to unravel. Daily life collapsed. In cities like Florence, as described by the writer Boccaccio in T.D. Cameron, the scale of death was unimaginable. At first, they tried to give the dead proper Christian burials. But soon, the graveyards were overflowing. Priests, doctors, and gravediggers were either dead themselves or too afraid to go near the sick. The dead were left in their homes, or their bodies were dragged out and left in the street. Mass graves were dug, giant pits where hundreds of bodies were layered like lasagna, as one chronicler put it, with thin layers of dirt in between. The bonds of family and community were shattered. Boccaccio wrote of how brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, sister by brother, and oftentimes wife by husband. Most chillingly, and noted that fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, as if they had not been theirs. It was a complete breakdown of the most fundamental human connections, all consumed by the instinct for self-preservation. With so many dead, who was left to till the fields, harvest the crops, or bake the bread? Farms were abandoned, and livestock roamed free. Trade ground to a halt. The economy, which had been flourishing, was shattered. The world was gripped by famine as well as plague. For those who survived, the world they knew was gone forever, replaced by a silent, empty landscape. But even in the darkest of times, humanity endures. The great dying, for all its horror, was not the end. It was, in many ways, a violent and brutal catalyst. For a new beginning, the catastrophic loss of life had profound and unexpected consequences that would echo for centuries. With up to half the population gone in some areas, the most fundamental resource of the medieval world, labor, was suddenly scarce. For the peasants and laborers who survived, their value skyrocketed. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, and more freedom. The rigid feudal system, which had bound serfs to the land for generations, began to crumble. This newfound power for the common person sparked social unrest and a series of peasant revolts across Europe, challenging the old order. The plague also spurred innovation. The immense loss of life forced people to find new, more efficient ways of doing things, encouraging the development of labor-saving technologies in medicine, while the immediate response was rooted in superstition. The failure of old methods led some to question traditional authorities. It planted the seeds for a more observational, evidence-based approach to medicine that would blossom during the Renaissance. The psychological shift was immense. The shared trauma and the stark reminder of mortality led to a change in art and literature, with a new focus on death and the human condition. But it also sparked a seize-the-day mentality in some, a desire to live life to the fullest, which contributed to the cultural explosion of the Renaissance. The Black Death was a crucible that tested humanity to its limits. It revealed the depths of fear and prejudice, but also the resilience of the human spirit. The cities of the dead did not remain silent forever. Slowly, painstakingly, they were repopulated, rebuilt, and reborn. The world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was fundamentally different. A world where the old certainties were gone, but new possibilities were on the horizon. The story of the Black Death is a somber reminder of our vulnerability, but it's also a powerful testament to our ability to survive, adapt, and build a new world from the ashes of the old. Imagine a world shrouded in darkness, not from the setting sun, but from a creeping, invisible terror. A world where the air itself feels heavy with dread, and the tolling of a church bell is no longer a call to prayer, but a constant, grim reminder of death. This was Europe, in the mid-14th century, a continent brought to its knees by the Black Death. Today, we're journeying back to this time of immense suffering, not just to look at the disease itself, but to understand the human heart in its darkest hour. We'll explore how faith, fear, and fire shaped a society teetering on the brink of collapse, and witness the birth of one of history's most iconic and terrifying figures, the plague doctor. When the plague first arrived, people looked to the heavens for answers. For centuries, the church had been the bedrock of society, the ultimate authority on life, death, and everything in between. So, naturally, the first question on everyone's lips was, why? The most common answer was a terrifying one. This was divine punishment. God was angry, unleashing his wrath upon a sinful world. This belief sparked a wave of extreme religious fervor. Processions of flagellants snaked through cities and towns, men and women publicly whipping themselves, their blood soaking the cobblestones, hoping their penance would appease an enraged deity. They believed their suffering could save humanity. But as the plague continued its relentless march, killing the pious and the sinner alike, faith began to fracture. Prayers went unanswered. The clergy, who were on the front lines performing last rites, died in droves. People started to question, if God was punishing sinners, why were his own servants being struck down? This crisis of faith was profound. Some abandoned religion altogether, embracing a life for today philosophy, indulging in every pleasure they could before their time was up. Others clung even tighter to their beliefs. But the solid foundation of religious authority was undeniably cracking. When divine explanations started to feel hollow, fear needed a new target. Human nature often seeks a scapegoat in times of crisis, a tangible enemy to blame for an intangible horror. And in medieval Europe, there was a long, tragic history of persecution. Jewish communities, already living as outsiders in many Christian societies, became the primary target. Vicious rumors spread like wildfire, accusing them of poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the plague. These accusations were baseless, fueled by a toxic mix of pre-existing prejudice, economic resentment, and sheer terror. The results were catastrophic. Across Europe, from France to Germany to Spain, thousands of Jewish people were rounded up, tortured into false confessions, and brutally murdered. Entire communities were wiped out, burned alive in their synagogues or expelled from their homes. Pope Clement VI even issued official decrees, stating that Jewish people were not to blame, they were dying from the plague just like everyone. But his words were drowned out by the roar of the mob. It's a dark reminder of how quickly fear can mutate into hatred and violence, turning neighbors against each other. Alongside religion and persecution, old world superstition ran rampant. People believed the plague was a miasma, a poisonous vapor or bad air that could corrupt the body. To combat these, they tried everything imaginable. They burned aromatic woods like pine and juniper in their homes and on street corners, hoping the smoke would purify the air. They carried pouches of herbs, called pomanders, filled with lavender, mint, and camphor, holding them to their noses whenever they went outside. Some people rang bells or fired cannons, believing that loud noises could break up the plague-filled air. Others, convinced the disease could enter through the eyes, went so far as to avoid looking at the sick. Physicians of the time, working with a limited understanding of medicine based on the ancient theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were utterly powerless. Their treatments were often more harmful than helpful. They prescribed bloodletting to balance the humors, which only weakened the patient. They lanced bubosta, painful swellings in the armpits, and groin which could lead to further infection. It was a time of desperate remedies, where science was entangled with folklore, and no one truly knew what worked. Amidst this chaos, a new kind of medical practitioner emerged, born from the sheer necessity of the crisis. These were the plague doctors, when most physicians fled the cities to save themselves. These individuals were hired by towns to treat the sick, regardless of their wealth. They weren't always the most respected doctors. Many were second-rate physicians, young professionals, looking to make a name for themselves, or even people with no formal medical training at all. But they were willing to face the plague head-on, and to do so, they needed protection. This led to the creation of one of history's most chilling images, the beaked mask. This iconic costume, which actually became more common in the 17th century but has its roots in this era, was a primitive form of personal protective equipment. The long, bird-like beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices, like mint, cloves, and myrrh. The theory was that these sweet-smelling substances would filter out the poisonous miasma before the doctor could breathe it in. The full uniform was a terrifying sight. The doctor wore a long, waxed leather coat that reached from neck to ankle, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat, which was a typical sign of a physician at the time. They carried a long wooden stick, which served a very practical purpose. It allowed them to examine patients without actually touching them. They could use it to lift bed sheets, point to areas of concern, and even push away desperate family members who got too close. While their medical effectiveness was limited, they mostly recorded death tolls and witnessed wills. Their presence was a symbol. They were a sign that society hadn't completely given up, that someone was still willing to walk into the shadow of death. They were both feared and respected, angels of mercy to some, harbingers of doom to others. Seeing a plague doctor approach your home often meant death was not far behind. The Black Death eventually receded, but it left a world transformed. It's estimated to have killed up to 60% of Europe's population. This massive loss of life had profound consequences. The severe labor shortage meant that peasants and workers who survived could demand higher wages and better conditions, shaking the foundations of the old feudal system. The crisis of faith weakened the absolute power of the Catholic Church, paving the way for new ideas, and eventually, the Reformation. Medical science, having been so brutally humbled, began a slow, painful journey towards a more empirical, evidence-based approach. The era of the plague doctor shows us humanity at its most vulnerable. It reveals our capacity for immense cruelty born from fear, our desperate search for meaning in the face of overwhelming suffering, and our incredible resilience. It's a story of how, in the darkest of times, we grapple with faith, superstition, and the first glimmers of scientific reason, all while staring death in the face. It's a somber chapter in our history, but one that teaches us invaluable lessons about fear, reason, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Picture Europe in the mid-14th century. It's a world teetering on the edge, crowded and deeply religious. Then, a shadow falls. An unimaginable catastrophe that would not just decimate the population, but completely reshape the world. This is the story of the aftermath of the Black Death, and how a new world was born from the ashes. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated, land was scarce, wages were low, and for the vast majority of the peasants and serfs' life was a grueling cycle of servitude, bound to the land of a lord. The social structure was rigid, a pyramid with nobles and clergy at the top, and everyone else at the bottom. There was little hope for change, for social mobility. It was a world set in stone, or so it seemed. Then, between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death swept across the continent. It's estimated to have wiped out 30 to 60% of Europe's population. It was a terrifying, indiscriminate killer. No one was safe, not the poor, not the rich, not the pious, not the sinner. The sheer scale of death is hard for us to comprehend today. Entire villages were wiped out. Cities became ghost towns. The air was thick with the smell of death and the sound of constant mourning. But in the wake of this immense tragedy, something unexpected began to happen. The old world was dying, and a new one was struggling to be born. Let's start with the most immediate change. The economy? With so many people gone, a massive labor shortage suddenly emerged. For the first time in centuries, the tables had turned. The survivors, the common laborers, found themselves in a position of power. Landowners and nobles were desperate for people to work their fields. Peasants could now demand higher wages. They were no longer tied to a single piece of land. If one lord wouldn't pay them what they were worth, they could simply pack up and move to another estate that would. This was revolutionary. The feudal system, which had defined medieval life for centuries, began to crumble. Serfdom, the practice of binding peasants to the land, went into a steep decline in Western Europe. Freedom of movement, once a dream, was becoming a reality for many. This new economic power translated into social change. The rigid class structure started to blur. Sumptuous laws, which dictated what different classes could wear, were enacted by the nobility to try and maintain the old distinctions. But they couldn't stop the tide. A newly prosperous class of merchants, artisans, and even some peasants began to rise. They had money, they had influence, and they wanted to enjoy the finer things in life: better food, better clothing, and better homes. This shift wasn't without conflict. The ruling classes tried to push back, attempting to freeze wages and restore the old order. In England, the Statute of Labourers was passed in 1351 to try and cap wages at pre-plague levels. This led to widespread resentment and eventually sparked massive uprisings, like the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. Although these revolts were often brutally suppressed, they were a clear sign that the old deference and acceptance were gone. The common person had found a voice, and they weren't afraid to use it. The psychological impact of the plague was just as profound. How do you make sense of a world where death is so random and widespread? For many, their faith was shaken. The church, which had been the unshakable pillar of medieval society, seemed powerless to stop the pestilence. Prayers went unanswered. Priests and monks died just as frequently as everyone else. This led to a crisis of faith for some, and for others, a shift in their religious focus. People began to seek a more personal, direct relationship with God, one that didn't necessarily need the church as an intermediary. This questioning of institutional authority planted a seed that would later blossom into the Protestant Reformation over a century later. At the same time, a life-for-the-moment mentality took hold for some. With death always lurking, there was a new emphasis on enjoying life on earth, rather than solely preparing for the afterlife. This carpe diem attitude was a stark contrast to the pre-plague mindset. And this is where we see the most glorious, unexpected consequence of the Black Death. The birth of the Renaissance. It seems counterintuitive, right? How could such a devastating event lead to one of the most brilliant periods of human creativity and discovery? Well, think about it. The massive loss of life meant that inheritances were consolidated. Fortunes that had been spread thin were now concentrated in the hands of the survivors. This created a new class of wealthy patrons, particularly in the city-states of Italy like Florence and Venice. These patrons, the Medici family being the most famous example, had immense wealth and a desire to display it. How did they do that? By commissioning art. They poured money into funding artists, architects, and scholars. This patronage allowed creative geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael to flourish. They were no longer just anonymous craftsmen. They were celebrated as individual artists. And what did they create? Art that was radically different. Medieval art was largely flat, two-dimensional, and focused purely on religious themes. Renaissance art, however, celebrated humanity. It embraced realism, perspective, and the beauty of the human form. This was a direct reflection of the new worldview. Humanism, a philosophy that emphasized human potential and achievements, became the intellectual engine of the Renaissance. Scholars turned back to the classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome, not just for religious insight, but for knowledge about science, politics, and art. This intellectual rebirth wasn't confined to the arts. The plague also spurred innovation in technology. With fewer laborers, people had to find more efficient ways to get things done. This led to the development of labor-saving devices. The most significant of all was the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. While not a direct result of the plague, the post-plague world was perfectly primed for it. The rising literacy rates and the hunger for new ideas created a massive market for printed books. Information could now be spread faster and wider than ever before. breaking the Church's monopoly on knowledge and fueling both the Renaissance and the later Reformation. Even medicine, which had failed so spectacularly during the plague, began to change. The crisis exposed the limitations of traditional, theory-based medicine. It forced a shift towards more practical, observational approaches. Doctors began to dissect human bodies, a practice previously frowned upon, in an effort to truly understand anatomy and the causes of disease. This was the slow, painful birth of modern medicine. So when we look back at the Black Death, it's easy to see only the horror and the tragedy, and we should never forget the immense human suffering. But history is complex and full of unintended consequences. The plague was a reset button for Europe. It shattered a rigid, stagnant society and, from the rubble, created the conditions for a new world to emerge. It empowered the common person, challenged established authority, and sparked an unprecedented explosion of art, science, and ideas. The world we live in today, with its emphasis on individual rights, scientific inquiry, and social mobility, has its distant roots in the ashes of the 14th century. The Black Death was a terrible, destructive force, but it was also, paradoxically, a creative one. It forced humanity to rebuild, to rethink, and to reimagine what was possible, ultimately paving the way for the modern age. Thank you so much for watching.